Great. So just missing Gabriel, I think, or no? Yeah, I see you are here. So great. All of you are here. So we'll get started. Okay. So it's what's great is that we're almost at the end of micro. We finished. We came a long way. And we today we're just talking about factor market. So this is one of the, I guess, larger topics that we are going to have to finish with micro. But after this, we only have public goods and externalities, and they're relatively short. So we're almost at the end line, and you guys have been great so far. And yeah. um, okay, so let's get started with factor markets. Okay, so factor markets, or also known as resource market or input markets. Okay, so far what we have talked about in micro is we've talked about supply and demand, but all of that has been related to the product market. Okay, so remember, product market is where households buy goods and services produced and sold by farms. Okay, so here we saw that the households are the buyer of goods and services. So any goods and services that you can imagine, pizza, personal computers, coffee, anything. But in the product market, the difference, or the product market is defined where households were the on the demand side. So they were households were the demanders, right? And farms or businesses are the ones that were selling those goods and services to households. Okay, and therefore farms were the ones that were doing the supply, and therefore we sort of talked about them as, or understood them as being the suppliers. So product market, households buying goods and services produced and sold by farms. Households are the demanders, and farms or businesses were the suppliers of those goods and services. Okay, now when we talk about resource market, which is something that we haven't really talked about much at all, all throughout our discussion in microeconomics. We talked about them a little bit when we talked about the circular flow model, and we talked about factors of production. But this is where we're going to go more in depth about how supply and demand is determined in the resource or factor markets. Okay, and how that determines other things. So resource markets, as you can imagine, this is where households provide farms with the factors of production that are then needed to produce those goods and services. Okay, so here households are no longer on the demand side, rather they are on the supply side, right? So because they're selling these factors of production, and we're going to talk about review those factors of production in a minute. But just to reiterate here, right, resource market or factors markets are where households are now the sellers. They are selling something, right, these factors of production to the farms, and then farms are going to use those factors of production to produce those goods and services and sell them in the product market. Okay, so here farms are the buyers of factors of production. So in this case, households would be the suppliers of factors of production, and farms would be the just think of them as the demanders.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
the factors of production, we're going to see what are the factors of production
Yes.
in the resource market later, right? Or
yes. So yes,
okay.
I'm just getting there. Like what those factors of production were. We talked about them briefly, very briefly, in the beginning of the course. When I was introducing, basically just at the beginning when we saw the circular flow model, and so these are the factors of production, right? Labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship, right? So these are the four broad categories, right, that we talk about in economics. That are all of these things are used to produce products. Okay, so labor, is just workers. It could be physical labor, it could also be mental labor. So physical labor, it's just somebody working, just a day laborer, or if you most of what you do is like entails doing physical work. But then there could also be mental labor, which is like somebody like a doctor or an economist or a surgeon. They don't have to do as much physical labor as they do have to do like intellectual or mental labor, right? And then we talked about land, which is everything that is available to use in nature. Like it could be minerals, wood, timber. So any natural resources that you can use as to then make goods and services. Okay. And we also talked about capital, which we said were what? Machines, tools, buildings, okay, manufactured goods that you can then use to produce goods and services. Okay, we don't really consider money as a capital in economics. You can think about it as financial capital, but most of what I have learned is that money is not considered a capital because you can't directly use money to produce goods and services. You can buy other stuff with money to make goods and services, but not you can't directly use money to buy or to make another end product or good or service. And then the last factor of production that we saw were entrepreneurship, which is when a person sort of combines all three of these other factors of production to start a business, right? So they take risks in that business, they assume responsibilities, and we call that entrepreneurship, which is also a factor of production. And for all of these, farms, as we saw, businesses, in order to produce goods and services, they have to use these factors of production, correct? And they don't get them for free, right? So farms have to pay a price to hire each type of factor, okay? So we call them factor payments, the payments that they have to make to use or to hire each one of these factors of production. So for labor, right, the factor payment for labor is wages. The factor payment for land is rent. The factor payment for capital is interest. For entrepreneurship, you can think about it as profit. Okay, and these factor payments, okay, are determined, just the way we saw in the product market. The price of products are determined by the forces of supply and demand in the product market. It works the same way in the resource market or the factor market. These prices are determined entirely by the market demand and the market supply of resources. The interaction of market demand and market supply, the forces sort of determine what the price of these factors is going to be. Okay. Any question so far? Hello?
Hello.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions? So Jaime, did that answer your question with regards to the factors of production?
Yes.
Okay, great. So then that sort of brings us back to this, circular flow model. I thought this would be a good idea to sort of recap this and also show you how the product market and the factor market are sort of interconnected with each other. You have, for the economy, right, has both of these, needs both of these in order to function, the product market and the factor market. So product market, remember we said that, this is where farms sell, right, goods and services, and this is where households buy goods and services. Factor market is where farms buy factors of production and households sell factors of production. So as you can see, the two entities here that we are only concerning ourselves with are households and farms. This is, I said this when we talked about this at first, this is a very rather simplistic version of the circular flow model. We have left out a lot of things such as the government, and the rest of the world. But once you bring them in, it provides a more accurate picture. But for the purposes of, for our purposes, this will be enough. So, just to talk about, households and farms or businesses and how they sort of interact in the product market and the factor market. Okay, so the circular flow model, as you, I don't know if you remember, but it sort of shows the flow of money, flow of dollars in the economy. So the solid arrows are showing, how sort of money travels in the economy or money moves around. Okay, and the dashed arrows are showing the flow of inputs and outputs. So how inputs and outputs move from one direction to another. So let's talk about this. So the product market, right, if we talk about the flow of inputs and outputs first, right? Farms produce goods and services and sell them in the product market. Okay, and these goods and services are then bought by households in the product market as well. Okay, households also sell something to farms. Okay, so these are outputs. When we're talking about goods and services, those are outputs. But households also sell something to farms or businesses, which are the factors of production. So they sell labor, land, capital, entrepreneurship, all those things in the factor market. Okay, and farms then use these factors of production, okay, to produce those goods and services. Okay, so it's a closed loop, right? Everything just sort of flows together. It's not one isolated thing. So if something you wouldn't be able to produce things in the product market and sell them to households if you weren't able to acquire, right, get or be able to acquire factors of production from households, right? If households didn't sell these things to farms in the factor market, they would not be able to make these goods and services whatsoever, right? So this is why they're so important. And on the other side, right, so that was the flow of inputs and outputs, how inputs and outputs flow in and out of the product market and factor markets. There's also another thing, right, which is the flow of dollars, right? So when farms buy factors of production from households in the factor market, they don't get them for free, right? Just like we talked about right now. So they have to make some sort of payments to household, okay, to receive those factors of production. So we just saw that the different factor payments where labor, the factor payment for labor was wage, the factor payment for land was rent, and so if I were to write the interest, so that factor payment for capital was interest, and for entrepreneurship it was profit. So farms have to make payments to households as well, right? And when these payments that farms pay to the households become the income for households, right? So for someone who's selling labor, right, they're receiving income. For someone who is renting, a piece of land that they own, that also becomes an income for them. So when farms make factor payments, they become income to households. And this is the income that the households then spend in the product market to buy those goods and services. And that money that they spend then becomes the revenues that farms earn from selling those goods and services. Okay, so they're, they're all interconnected and interrelated with each other. You wouldn't have one without the other. So this is why, we saw one, we so far we've only been focusing on this part, product market. We talked about demand and supply and all those really important things, but all of that related to the product market. So now we're kind of we're gonna take a look at how things are determined in the factor market. So when farms decide, I am gonna need um, I'm gonna need to hire 10 workers, to produce output for me in the short run. How do they go about hiring those workers in the labor market? So how does that work? So this is what we're going to be focusing on. Okay. Do you guys have any questions about this?
I have a question.
Yeah, okay.
Does this include households and firms keeping the revenue and their income, or does this relate with um, household and firms spending all of their income on products?
So so are you talking about like households? So here, for the simplistic assumptions, this is what we sort of talked about in the beginning of the course. For simplicity, we assume that they spend all of their money to buy those goods and services. Okay, so you can think about, households also save some of their income, right? So most people do that. Most households don't spend all of their income to buy goods and services. For farms as well, right? They don't. They probably don't use all of their revenues to pay workers, or for other factors of production. But for the sake of, I guess, simplicity, we said that we sort of assume that households here spend all of their income to buy goods and services. So because there are other things that are related, like it would get more complicated if we had to introduce how savings sort of work in this situation. But we sort of assume a simplistic model to begin with.
Okay, thank you.
Then so when we talked about 4 different factors of production, right? Labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. But for the purposes of this course, and then this is how the AP exam is also structured, they focus mostly on one of those factors, which is labor. Okay, so we're going to be mostly focusing on the labor market. So the analysis that we do here with the labor market also extends to land and capital. So you can think about it, that analysis also extends to those other 2 factors. But entrepreneurship gets more complicated, so we don't really talk about that. But um, for the most part, when we talk about factor markets, we're mostly going to be talking about the labor market. Okay, and we assume a perfectly competitive labor market here. Well, we're also going to see a little bit of what an imperfect competition in the labor market looks like, but we're going to begin by talking about the perfectly competitive labor market. So if you remember, when we talked about the product market, we also have we talked about the perfectly competitive product market as well. Okay, so let's see how they compare. So here in the perfectly competitive labor markets, many small farms are hiring many workers with identical skills and abilities. Okay, so if you think back to perfectly competitive product market, we had also many small farms that were selling, right, identical products, and no one farm was large enough to manipulate the market. So here, it's just that the roles are now kind of reversed, because the farms are no longer on the supply side of the equation, they're on the demand side. Okay, so here many small farms are hiring many workers with identical skills and abilities. So as you can imagine, we're not talking about a highly skilled labor market. It's mostly like blue collar labor. So which is why workers have mostly identical skills and abilities. So it's not surgeons or it's not dentists or something like that. It's mostly people working construction jobs or something where they have, or somebody working as a cleaner in McDonald's. It doesn't require any particular skills and abilities, and we assume that a lot of workers have those same skills and abilities. Okay, and so the farms are just are only hiring, that there are many workers, as we just mentioned, right? There are many workers with identical skills and abilities, and every individual farm is only hiring a small portion of the entire market. Okay, so no one farm is really large enough to manipulate the market. So as you can see, this is bringing back a lot of memories from the perfectly competitive product market, as we saw, right? There was the same idea. No one farm was they're also large enough to manipulate the market. Okay, so wage, right? Wage is the price of labor, right? So this is the price that farms have to pay to their workers in order to use those factors of production. So the wage rate is constant in this perfectly competitive labor market. So this is also very similar to what we saw in the perfectly competitive product market. So we talked about, when we talked about product market, we only talked about price, right? So now, right, so the price of the good or something. So that was, we just called it price. But here, of course, we're talking about labor as a factor of production. So the price of labor is wage, and therefore wage is constant in this perfectly competitive labor market. And it's determined by the market demand and market supply of labor. So whatever is determined as the wage in the market, the farm must pay its hired workers the market wage. Okay, so that's why we say that individual farms in this perfectly competitive labor market are wage takers. Okay, so because they can hire as many workers as they can at the market wage that was set by the market by the forces of demand and supply, but they don't need to raise their wage in order to attract workers, but they're gonna have to make sure that they pay exactly that same market wage that was determined by the market to every single one of their workers. So individual farms are wage takers in that sense. Okay, they have no influence on the market wage. They just have to take it as given and pay their workers that market determined wage rate. Okay, and as you can imagine, for the workers, it's the same situation. They don't really have any say, right? They just have to accept the market price, that has been set by the industry as given as well, right? So the farms, right, they don't need to raise wages in order to attract workers because they can hire as many as they want at the market wage rate. Why do you think they wouldn't lower their wage?
Because there's no need.
Okay, so they don't need to raise wages. What about if they wanted to lower wage?
Because all workers are the same.
Right. So what would happen if they tried to lower their wage?
They wouldn't get any.
Exactly. And why not? Because there are so many other farms, right, who is going to be paying them at least the market wage rate. So they can't raise the wage, right? They don't need to raise the wage, but they wouldn't lower the wage either. They would only pay the market wage. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes, I was just thinking like price instead of wage. I got a little bit confused because higher price is like better for firms, but lower wage is better for
Yes,
firms as
exactly.
well. So I got a little bit confused.
Okay, no worries. How are the rest of you feeling? Like Sarah, Gabriel, Judith, haven't really heard from any of you. So is this making sense, or are you clear about the distinction between product market and labor market, or what is going on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Great. Okay. So this right here, as you can see, this is I've drawn the two graphs side by side for a perfectly competitive product market. So this is a perfectly competitive product market, and this is the perfectly competitive factor market. So because we're talking about labor, I've only shown labor market, the perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, so as right, this is the the supply and demand where they intersect. This is the equilibrium price, this is the equilibrium quantity, right, of goods and services. So this is the price of the good, this is the quantity of the good that are going to be bought and sold in equilibrium in the product market, right? And the factor market looks very similar, right? The only difference here is that this is the price of labor, right, which is on the vertical axis. This is now wage, right? So this is price of labor, right, from the farm's point of view. So this is the price of labor, and this is the quantity of labor. Okay, so we have denoted as L. So it is also determined the market supply and the market demand of labor also determines what the equilibrium wage rate is and the equilibrium quantity of workers that are going to be hired. Okay. Any questions? Or does this feel, pretty simple? Hello?
Well, it seems like the same thing, just like with different terminology.
Yes, exactly. So, if you wanted to make this, seem, they are, similar, right? The ideas are pretty similar. It's just that, it is different terminologies, and, how you think about it, it's going to be different because now, farms are no longer on the supply side, but they're on the demand side, and the households are now on the supply side. Okay, so here, I just wanted to mention here that we haven't really, we only saw the market graphs, right? The graph for individual farms is going to look a little bit different because we said that individual farms here are wage takers. So we'll see that in a later on when we go into this a little bit more in detail. But this is the market, the labor market graph. This is not the individual farms demand and supply. So that's going to look a little bit different, as you can remember from perfect competition, right? We had the market, right? This was the market, product market, right? This was the supply and demand, and how market price, equilibrium price, and quantity was determined in the product market. And then the farm, right? We said that the farms were price takers in perfect competition, and therefore we just sort of extended this price because they had to accept this market price as given, and this was also their demand, which was also equal to their marginal revenue, and then there was marginal cost over here. And then from there, we went on to determine the profit maximizing quantity that is going to be produced in this market. Okay, so we have something similar to this situation in the factor market as well, but we will talk about this. That this line, the perfectly elastic line, is something that is different in the factor market. Okay. And that comes from these roles being reversed now that the households are on the supply side and the farms are on the demand side. This is why this is going to be a little bit different. Okay, so we just saw that the market, the perfectly competitive labor market, right? We saw that graph, and there is supply of labor, there's demand for labor. So what do we really mean by those things? Okay, so the demand for labor, right, is the different quantities of workers that businesses are willing and able to hire at different wages. Okay, so as you can imagine, if we have, if you're trying to find the demand for labor, we have wage on the vertical axis and quantity of labor on the horizontal axis. And, this is exactly what this this graph is showing us, right? At each different wages, how many different quantities of workers that businesses are going to be willing and able to hire. As you can see, right, the demand curve for labor is downward sloping, and it's inversely related to the price of labor or wage. So at higher wages, as wage rises, farms are willing to hire at this quantity of L1. But if wages were to drop at this wage of W2, farms are willing and able to hire uh, more, right? More workers, right? At L2. So at higher wages, at wages rise, farms demand less labor, and at lower wages, if wages fall, farms will demand more labor, which makes sense, right? Intuitively. Hello?
Yes.
Okay. So then, so this is just that is the demand for labor, and we saw that the demand for labor is inversely related to the price of labor or wage. There is also something else which is known as the marginal revenue product of labor, and a farm's demand for labor is based on this thing, the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, so let's examine what this is. So in order for a farm to decide the quantity of workers that they're going to hire, right, they basically need to be able to determine the value of hiring an additional worker. Okay, so they need to be able to, they have to figure out some way of knowing what is the value of hiring an additional worker to me. Okay, and this is exactly what the marginal revenue product of labor tells them. Okay, technically, the definition for marginal revenue product of labor is it is the addition to a farm's revenue when an additional worker is hired. Okay, so how much does my total revenue change when I bring in an additional worker, when I hire an additional person? So how much does that person add to my total revenue? Okay, so this is the formula for MRPL, which is the change in total revenue from change in labor. Okay, this is exactly what we saw right now. So the how much does my total revenue change, or how much will an additional worker add to my total revenue? Okay, so this is change in total revenue divided by the change in labor. Okay, and if we manipulate this thing a little bit, okay, so MRPL, so marginal revenue product of labor, that's the shorthand for MRPL is the shorthand for that. So if this is change in total revenue divided by the change in labor, okay, if we manipulate this a little bit more, we get, so if I do this, change in total revenue divided by change in quantity, and change in quantity divided by change in labor, as you can see, right, these two cancel out each other, and if we're then left with change in total revenue divided by change in labor, right? But by doing this, by bringing in these two, by bringing in this additional component, this allows me to look at it from a different perspective, because this is also something that we are very familiar with, and this is something that we're also very familiar with. So what is the change in total revenue when I hire, or sorry, when I increase my output by one more? What do we call this thing?
The marginal product.
Okay, so remember, marginal product has to do with, it will have output as the answer, right? So this, right, um, the change in total revenue from selling one more, or from producing one more, that we know as marginal revenue. Okay, the change in total revenue. So how much does my total revenue change when I produce one more unit of output? So that is exactly what we know as marginal revenue. Okay. And then this portion right here, the change in quantity divided by the change in labor, right? So this is basically telling us what happens, right? If I hire an additional worker, right, which is L, how does that change my total output? So how, what is the additional output that is produced by hiring one more worker? So this is also something that we have seen before, and we called this the marginal product of labor. Okay, so the MRPL really boils down to the product of these two things: the marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. Okay, and we got this by manipulating this formula, just like tweaking it a little bit. Okay, but this tells us something valuable, as we will see. Okay, so how are you guys feeling about this demonstration that you just saw? Like, this, is this making sense, or you're just how do you guys feel?
This is good, at least for me.
Okay, the rest of you, do you guys have any questions? Something not making sense, you can tell me. Okay, so once, I'm gonna assume that you guys don't have any questions, but it's likely that you might, so it's okay to speak up and let me know. Okay, so then we found that the MRPL is equal to the marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. So let's take a look at how this looks like on a table and also on the graph. Okay, so what is it that the marginal revenue product of labor, it's basically, what is it telling us? Like, why do we care about this? Okay, so the marginal revenue product of labor. So on this table right here, you have, let's say we're talking about a bakery. Okay, and they can produce loaves of bread. Okay, so this bakery can hire from anywhere from 0 to 6 workers, and this column right here is the total product. Okay, total product of labor. So if I hire 0 workers, they produce 0 loaves of bread. If I hire 1 worker, they'll produce 6. He can produce 6 loaves of bread. 2 workers together can produce 11. 3 workers together can produce 15 loaves of bread, and on and on. So this is the total product. Okay, and then here in this column we have the marginal product of labor, right? And this is just what we saw in the previous slide. The marginal product of labor is the change in total output or total product divided by the change in labor. So how did I get these numbers? 6, 5.
By seeing the change in quantity and the change in labor, or you can subtract the total product from its previous total product.
Okay, great. So does everybody see that? So, Patricia, can you hear me? Okay. So in
Yes.
any case, we see that the marginal product of labor, right now, which we just basically follow this formula, which is the change in quantity, or in this case, it would be total product or total output, right? So for the the marginal product, of course, it doesn't exist for for zero workers, because we don't know what the total product was. It just doesn't make any sense for if you haven't hired anybody, they don't produce any total product, and therefore there is the marginal product for the zero unit. It just doesn't exist. Okay, for the first worker, we just do this, right? It's the first worker can produce 6 total products, and you would just do 6 minus 0, which was the total product from the first worker, and then total product when you hadn't hired any from 0 workers, divided by 1, right? So that the change in labor was going from 0 to 1, which is 1 minus 0, or that gives you 6. So this is how we do it for every single one of these quantities. So and then we get these numbers. So 11 minus 6, and then the change in labor is always 1. It's because we're going in 1 increments. So 11 minus 6 is 5, 15 minus 11 is 4, 18 minus 15 is 3, and on and on. Okay, and then remember, we assume that we're talking about a perfectly competitive labor market. But the other thing that we also assume here is that we are also in a perfectly competitive product market. Okay, assume that we're in a perfectly competitive product market as well. So what that means is that my marginal revenue, as you remember from the I drew that graph somewhere over here. So for individual farms, as we know, in perfect competition, they're price takers, and their demand, right, is equal to their marginal revenue, and which means that for every additional output that they sell, right, which is the marginal revenue is always going to be equal to the price, because every time they sell one more, they're only going to be bringing the additional revenue is always going to be equal to price, because the price is fixed, right? It's a constant number. So every time they sell one more, they're going to be bringing in the marginal revenue. The additional revenue that they bring in is always going to be equal to that price. So this is why in that column, the marginal revenue, right, is equal to price, and it's a fixed number. Okay, and then I can calculate the marginal revenue product of labor, or MRPL, by doing this. I can multiply the marginal product of labor times the price at every single units, or at different quantities of labor. Okay, so this is what we do here. So it's MPL times P. So this I got from, doing 6 times 2, and then 5 times 2, 4 times 2, 3 times 2, 2 times 2, and 1 times 2. Okay, so this is, gives me 12, 10, 8, 6, 4, and 2 for that column, the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, and what this number basically is telling me, okay, is that, so for the first worker, right, the additional output that they were able to make 6 loaves of bread per hour. Okay, and we were able to sell that loaf of bread for $2 each. So the addition to our revenue from that first worker was 6 times 2 or $12. And the basically what we understand here from the marginal revenue product is that this is how much we value that employee, is how much he is adding to our total revenue. So he is adding $12 to our revenue, and so this is the maximum amount that we would be willing to pay this worker. That first worker would be willing to pay him $12. Okay, because he can make the marginal product of labor for him is 6 per hour times what we can sell that loaf of bread for. Each loaf of bread sells for 2, so 6 times 2 is $12 per hour. For the second worker, his marginal product of labor is 5, and 5 times 2 is 10. So this is how much, right, he is adding to the revenue for the farm. So this is the maximum amount that the farm would be willing to pay to that second worker. Okay, nothing more. They wouldn't pay a penny more than $10. Okay, because all they care about is how much revenue the worker contributes per hour. Okay, and the contribution for every single worker is going to be equal to their marginal revenue product, and therefore they would only be willing to pay anything up to, but nothing greater than each worker's MRPL. Okay, so then what we see here, if we were to plot the marginal revenue product against the quantity of labor, what we see here is that this MRPL is equal to the wage that farms would be willing to pay in order to hire each worker. So at the first worker, right, they would be willing to pay all the way up to $12. Okay, because this is how much that worker is adding to their total revenue. So $12 is how much they would be willing to pay to hire that first worker. But for the third worker, because his marginal product is lower than the first worker, so the first worker's marginal product was 6, he could make 6 loaves of bread per hour. And then for the third worker, he could only make 4. So therefore, his marginal revenue product was lower than the first worker. So the first worker, it was 12. For the third worker, it's at 8, right? So this is, for the third worker, the maximum amount that the farm would be willing to pay him is $8. Okay, they would also be happy to pay him anything less, like $7.50, but nothing more than 8. The maximum they would be willing to pay is 8. So what we can see from here is this is exactly what we know as the demand for labor. Okay, so that's why the marginal revenue product of labor is also the demand curve for labor for a perfectly competitive farm. Okay, because they eventually work out to mean the same thing, because MRPL is equal to the wage rate, the maximum amount that a farm would be willing to pay to hire each worker. Okay, because that is exactly how much that worker adds to the revenue per hour. Okay, so
I have a question.
yeah, Gabriel.
Why would the firms pay the same price as what the labor, like what the worker is going to earn then? Why wouldn't they want to earn profits?
So for farms, right? So this is their willingness to pay for labor, right? So so for workers, right, paying them, that's a cost. Okay, so they're gonna compare, like we do everywhere in economics, right? They're comparing marginal benefit and marginal cost. Okay, so MRP is sort of synonymous to the marginal revenue product of labor is synonymous to the marginal benefit. So the value of each additional worker to the farm is this MRPL, and they're going to compare that to the marginal cost, right? The additional cost for hiring each additional worker. So for them, right, it makes sense that they're trying to figure out how much does each additional worker add to my total revenue. Okay, so the question of like comparing these two is going to come later, and how they determine like where their profit is going to be maximized, that's going to come later. But for now, we're looking at one side of the equation, which is the marginal benefit, or the marginal revenue product of labor is sort of represents this marginal benefit. So what is the value to me of hiring additional workers? So the value for that worker to me is how much total revenue that worker can earn me. I'm sorry, how much extra revenue that worker adds to my total revenue. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Does anybody have any more questions? Okay. If not, we're going to stop here for today and resume in talking about supply of labor, and yes, just continue with factor market when you guys come back next week. So we don't have class on Thursday due to Thanksgiving, but I'll see you all next Tuesday.
Okay, bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.